This is Mark Sobel, U.S. Chair, OMFIF. Today, OMFIF and I are deeply honored to host Larry Summers. For decades, Larry has been one of the world's foremost, most recognized and renowned economists and economic thinkers. He's gained particular attention in the last year for his views on inflation and monetary policy, one of the topics we will explore today. Larry was the 8th director of the National Economic Council in 2009 and 2010, a job he held under President Obama during the global financial crisis. I know him better for his distinguished service at the U.S. Treasury Department as Undersecretary for International Affairs between 1993 and 1995, a time when I'd see him almost daily. And between him and David Lipton, I learned more economics than I ever did in a classroom. Larry was then Deputy Secretary and the 71st Secretary of the Treasury of the United States of America. So I plan to put questions to Larry for the first 30 minutes or so, and then the audience can submit questions via that chat function. Welcome, Larry. Great honor to have you.
Mark, it's great to be with you and great to see you again. I didn't always agree with you when we worked together, but I always learned a great deal from you.
Well, thank you for those semi-kind words. So before we launch into policy discussion, could you give us your outlook for the U.S. economy in 2022 and 2023, growth, prices, employment? A lot of forecasters have Q4 22 CPI in the 2.5% to 3% range with further declines in 2023. I've seen that you don't buy this at all for 2022, but I still have a question around 2023. And then there's questions about the Great Resignation, the future of labor force participation, and what that might imply for prices. So what's your take on all this?
So I think the Fed view, which is also the consensus view, that we are going to have for the next 2 years remarkably easy financial conditions, unemployment below 4%, and inflation converging towards below 3%. I think the probability that all three of those things are going to happen together is less than 1 in 5. I think that the current level of tightness in labor markets and the current level of wage inflation is entirely inconsistent with inflation getting into the 2% neighborhood. What I'm much less sure of is which of those 3 pillars of the existing outlook will fail. My best guess is that they will all fail. My best guess is that inflation will not come down in the way that is expected. My guess is that growth will disappoint because of a combination of what the inflation does to consumer sentiment and what the Fed tightening does to financial markets and ultimately to economic activity. And my guess is that the Fed will again be surprised and discover itself to be behind the curve and therefore raise rates more than is now priced in, leading to more tightening in financial conditions than is now expected. So I would expect that at the end of 2022, we will have inflation above 3%, unemployment above 4%, and rates above 1 1/4. I think that the history suggests that a central bank that is well behind the curve is rarely able to stabilize inflation without causing significant turbulence in economic activity. And I think the right reading of the data is that while there are transitory elements in current inflation, there are also reasons for seeing an acceleration in inflation pressures, notably what's happening in the labor market and notably what's happening in housing. And therefore, I am expecting the failure of all three pillars.
Well, thank you for that. So, as I understand it, one of your arguments is that the Biden $1.9 trillion package put far more support into the U.S. economy beyond its potential than it could absorb, and thus overheated the economy and has triggered inflation. So, in short, your focus is on excess aggregate demand. So let's stipulate that there is excess aggregate demand. But others have emphasized supply chain disruptions, shifts in demand from services to durables, for example. You're familiar with all the arguments. And obviously, supply and demand interact. So to what extent do you think those forces have been at work? Do you expect those supply side oriented forces, shall we say, to dissipate? And then do you see signs of any wage price spiral?
If you're in a bathtub, it is incumbent on you not to run the water to the point where it overflows. In order to avoid running the water to the point where it overflows, you have to make some judgment about how much clogging there is in the drain. But it doesn't really, you have to make that judgment. But the discovery that there is some clogging in the drain does not excuse running the water so vigorously that the bathtub overflows, nor is it make any sense to wait until the bathtub is completely full before you turn the water down and turn the faucet down. I use that analogy to characterize macroeconomic policy during the last year. How could anyone have supposed that after COVID, there would not be bottlenecks, that there would not be structural changes that would be disruptive? And how could anyone have not calibrated their judgments about how much demand to have? Demand and excess demand is not only a matter of fiscal policy. Fiscal and monetary policy can offset each other. But instead, in the face of the most expansionary fiscal policy in history, peacetime history, the Fed decided to run the most expansionary monetary policy in peacetime history. And it decided to do that even after the GDP gap was completely within a normal historical range, with all of it being reinforced by a big overhang in savings. So I think that this is best attributed to demand, A, because demand needs to be calibrated to supply, B, because if you look at nominal GDP, which doesn't have the problem about bottlenecks, it was at an unsustainable and exorbitant rate last year. So, and C, because there's the usual confusion of relative prices and absolute prices. Used car prices did spike in an unusual way, but because people were spending their money on those used cars, they had less money to spend on other things, which presumably meant less price pressure in those areas. So I think the right dominant hypothesis is the one that emphasizes aggregate demand. And I can't help but note that those whose analysis was based on aggregate demand have not been surprised by the monthly figures each month. And those who base their analysis on component by component judgments about things that are transitory have been surprised each month. nor can I resist pointing out that the analytical paradigm that has been used in many circles, which does emphasize component by component analysis of the CPI, does have a historical precedent. It was Arthur Burns' mode of analysis as his monetary policies set off the most rapid inflation that we've ever seen in this country in peacetime.
So, well, great entree then. Let's turn to macro policy. Let's start with monetary policy. Do you have any specific thoughts on the needed amount of Fed rate hikes, the terminal Fed funds rate? And I'd actually be quite curious if you'd share your thoughts with us on balance sheet policy, how quickly it should be brought down, and what the interaction between rate policy and balance sheet policy is. And since everybody's talking about in the media these days, 25 versus 50 points in March.
Mark, you told me you were going to ask me 6 or 7 questions. You didn't tell me that each one was going to be a compound question with 4 parts, but I'll do the best. I'll do the best I can. I think the Fed, as I've said, is in a very difficult position. My recommendation would be that they call a special meeting and end QE right now. I don't think that would make any large impact relative to ending QE a few weeks from now, but it would dramatize that they realize that we're in a different world and that they understand the first rule of holes is when you're in one to stop digging. That's where I would start. I can't prescribe for the appropriate policy at the March meeting. We don't know whether there's going to be a war underway when that meeting takes place. And so it seems to me we don't know what's going to be happening in financial markets. And so it seems to me that it would be premature to reach a judgment as to what should be done in March. I think in general, I have avoided being part of the dialogue about will it be 4 raises, will it be 7 raises, will it be 7 raises this year? Because I think what ultimately matters for economic activity is the nature of financial conditions. And I can't predict with confidence, and I don't think anybody else can either, what the effect of changes in rates will be on credit spreads, on stock markets, on currencies, nor can I predict what exogenous judgments there will be. There will be in the market, endogenous responses to whatever's happening in the economy, there will be. There looks to me to be significant elements of froth in markets. I would say that I think the appropriate level of financial conditions at the end of the year is likely to be quite substantially tighter than the appropriate level of financial conditions that we have observed in recent months. I think the questions around balance sheet policy are very difficult, and I don't have strong conviction about what to do. I think my instincts are that rates are a more predictable instrument, and therefore I would put greater reliance on rates in a very uncertain period. And other than allowing runoff to take place, I would certainly not do more on in terms of balance sheet policy, but that is not a completely confident judgment. What I would say is that the Fed, I think, is years late to adopt the principle or readopt the principle of humble and nimble. I think the Fed has over time done very substantial damage to its credibility with the fashion of engaging in extensive forward guidance, extensive discussion and description of its reaction function, extensive use of the dot plots. I think all of that reflects a failure to understand what Alan Greenspan, who certainly wasn't perfect, but Alan Greenspan understood something very important that the Delphic oracles also understood, which is that if you're regarded as omniscient and omnipotent, but you're actually not, it's a good idea to preserve the illusion by speaking in general and oracular ways rather than making a whole range of specific forecasts. The last thing I'll say, and I think I'll now have covered all the elements in your question, is I think the terminal rate is a mystery. The market belief that you can end a business cycle expansion with unemployment in the 3s, starting with inflation in the 5s, with a sub 2% rate is a very surprising one and a very odd one relative to historical patterns. I think there are 3 possible interpretations, and obviously they probably have significant overlap. The first is that the market's wrong and that it's going to continue to be surprised on the high side by what happens to rates. And certainly that would be my best guess, that we will see 10-year rates well above what is priced into the forward curve right now. The second is that the market is pricing in, and it's sort of ironic for me to say this, that the market is pricing in a stronger secular stagnation view than the one I took for years. If you believe that the prevailing propensity to save relative to the prevailing propensity to invest is very strong, then you would believe that even in the presence of very high debt levels, and even in the presence of very substantial deficits, that markets would clear only at very low levels of rates. And that is certainly an interpretation, but it's hard to look at a terminal rate of 2 without seeing a neutral rate, given the inflation path, of -1, which does seem an extraordinarily low level of the neutral rate. Another way of making essentially the same argument is the economy can't withstand a 3% interest rate. Well, an economy that can't withstand a 3% interest rate, even in the presence of a 5% of GDP budget deficit, is an economy that has a kind of deep bias towards deflation. I think the third possibility is that the market is judging that this inflationary period will end like other inflationary periods do, with recession, and that that is what is holding down, that the 2% rate we see, 2% terminal rate, is in some sense an average of a 4% terminal rate if the economy doesn't go into recession, and a 0% rate if it does. I think the options markets suggest rather less dispersion of expectations than the little example I just provided would suggest. So I don't think that explains things completely. But I think the terminal rate is a mystery, and those would be the three dominant possibilities I would point to.
Well, thank you for that. Let me turn to fiscal policy. We've already talked about the impact of the American Rescue Plan. We can easily finance our debt GDP ratio, even though 100% years ago, many would have thought unthinkable. But some say we need to bring it down and adopt reforms in light of looming demographics. You just mentioned that you've talked a lot about secular stagnation, and you've argued for infrastructure spending, especially given negative real interest rates as a way to bring up investment. I mean, how do you put your fiscal policy, all of this together in terms of your short, medium, and longer term outlook? And how much restraint do you expect out of fiscal policy this year?
So I don't think that the analysis of fiscal impact measures that show some kind of big change between 2021 and 2022 is particularly fruitful, Mark, because I think it's pretty clear that a very substantial fraction of what was transferred to households in 2021 was put in their bank accounts or used to pay down their credit card debt, and will therefore increase spending in 2022. So I don't think the actual impact on demand was as large as those measures would suggest in 2021. And I think a bunch of it was deferred to 2022. My go forward principle would be that we should pay for investments that we make, and that we should not have, given the inflationary pressure in the economy, new measures that are unpaid for and increase deficits. That as we implement that policy, we should make productive public investments. And I think there are a variety of productive public investments to make in areas from educating young children to the green economy, to infrastructure. I think we should not. I think we need to pay more attention than, frankly, we have, not just to the levels of investment we engage in, but to the quality of the investment. I see statistics like the observation that it costs 7 times as much to build the Second Avenue subway in Manhattan as to build the Paris metro. And those make me nervous about the efficiency with which we spend. I look at the design of programs for childcare and am left feeling I want to make sure that we're focusing on the interests of children rather than on the interests of childcare providers. I look at support for higher education, which I think is hugely important, but I think we need to make sure that that's going to make higher education more affordable to students, not bureaucratic life more comfortable for higher education administrator bureaucrats. So I like spending, but I like it in a more tough-minded way, and I like it fully paid for.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to put 2 more questions to you and then start inviting audience questions. Just one, since we know each other from our days working on international financial issues, US-China tensions are the hot topic these days. Relationship is frosty. Janet Yellen said we will cooperate where we can and compete where we must. So in the Bush-Obama years, efforts were made to engage China. So what's your take on U.S. policy towards U.S.-China economic and financial relations? Is it overly confrontational, or is it justified given Chinese behavior, or is there room for more nuance?
I think I think there have been tendencies towards the rejection of dialogue, and I think that's almost certainly unwise. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Whatever you think, I think if we were in more dialogue with China, that would be better. I think the maintaining tariffs, if maintaining tariffs over buying targets is, I think, a quite problematic policy. If China bought more poultry, if China bought more pork, it would simply serve to drive up prices and exacerbate inflation in the United States. And in response to their failure to do those things, what we're doing is putting tariffs on that also raise prices in the United States. So it's kind of a stop or I'll shoot myself in the foot kind of policy. And I think we should work our way off of that. I think we need to understand that the decisions China makes are much less about us and much more driven by the internal imperatives of their system than we often like to suppose. And I think it's a consequential error for us not to recognize that. I think China has been stunningly adversarial on a variety of dimensions. And that's not something, it seems to me, that any US administration can responsibly ignore. But I think it is the essence of strategy to define one's objectives, consider one's degree of leverage to achieve those objectives, and to consider what concessions one is prepared to make to achieve one's objectives. And I think it tends to be the American way of strategy to conflate a strategy with a wish list. And that can be a quite problematic strategy.
So everybody's talking about central bank digital currencies these days. So I have two questions on this front. First of all, just generally speaking, is this a good idea or not? How do you think about it? And then secondly, I see a lot of people suggesting that a Chinese CBDC could have implications for the dollar's reserve role. I don't really get that. To me, the US may need to make progress in strengthening its payment systems and the like, but the dollar is the world's reserve currency because of the depth and liquidity and openness of our capital markets and the basic respect for property rights. And I don't see why China having a CBDC would accord it such properties, for example. But so what are your views on these two questions?
Less interesting for your audience. I think I agree with you, Mark. I think that the presence or absence of CBDCs is largely an issue about the design of an efficient payment system. And that's an important issue, but it is not a transcendent issue on which the fate of nations depends. We, in some sense, have such CBDCs. Banks have accounts at the central bank. Those accounts are denominated and kept track of on computers and are changed through keystrokes, not through the handing over of pieces of paper. So the bulk of our financial system is based, and has been for some years now, based on digital currency. Will there be a greater role for blockchain? I imagine yes. Do those systems need to very substantially evolve? Yes. Is there a crucial role for the central bank in mediating exchange, just as the Fed handled check clearance years ago? Yes. Does that mean that every American or most Americans should have some kind of account at the Fed? I very much doubt that that would be wise, both because I'm not sure the Fed would be good at providing the liability in an attractive form, and then it would have to choose what assets to invest in. And I'm not sure we want those decisions to be made in a centralized way. Is China in danger of replacing the dollar as a reserve currency? It's not the most pleasant or serious crack, but I've heard myself say on occasion that Europe is a museum, Japan is a nursing home, China is a jail, and Bitcoin is an experiment. And so the dollar has rather a long way to go, I would guess, as a reserve currency. And I think if somehow that were to dissipate and somehow the dollar were to lose its status as a reserve currency, I think it would be likely to have to do with mistakes that we made of two sorts. Either mistakes that we made of abusing the power that it gave us to engage in sanctions to the point where there became a very strong desire to have parallel networks that were immune from us, and the extent to which it led us to, we were somehow led into quite irresponsible macroeconomic policies that caused people to be reluctant to remain engaged with the dollar. But as I look at the rather substantial increases in the arbitrary exercise of authority and the rather substantial financial uncertainties and the rather substantial movements towards greater politicization of commercial life in China, I think I would have to say that the prospects for the RMB as a reserve currency competing seriously with the dollar appear considerably more remote to me than they did 3 or 4 years ago, when they still seemed quite remote.
Well, I totally agree with you there. Well, one questioner asks, the Fed is clearly behind the curve, but what are your views on the ECB?
I have much less strong views on the ECB, both because it seems more appropriate to prescribe for one's own country than for others, and because I try to have stronger views where I feel better informed. I was encouraged by Christine Lagarde's recent indications of increased concern about inflation and signals that the ECB may act sooner than had previously been anticipated. I think that reflects a Europe that is some distance behind the United States in terms of the overheating and inflation process, but that understands that the United States made serious mistakes of getting behind the curve, and wants to avoid making those kinds of mistakes. In general, I think that it's important to recognize that for reasons that the economics profession doesn't fully understand, inflation tends to come and go with significant correlation across countries. And so I think the kind of steps that Christine took were welcome.
So one questioner asked, to what extent an inflation rate higher than actual rates could be a way for the Fed and the ECB to reabsorb the liquidity pumped into the economy during the pandemic? And if I can pile on that another question, which is, so basically the US ECB, we have, let's say, 2% inflation targets these days. I think David Wilcox, among others, has advocated for a 3% inflation target. You know him well. He was at Treasury as Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy. Is there anything wrong with the 3% inflation target? Do you think we need to make strenuous efforts to get back to 2%, or do you have a view on that?
I think if you took the Fed's rhetoric seriously, you would have to get below 2%, because they want to average 2% over time. And we're clearly going to have a fairly protracted bout with above 2%. And so if you took their frameworks seriously, you would have to get below 2%. And I think that is almost certainly ill-advised. I worry about 3. 3 becomes 3 on the PCE, and that can easily be 3.5 on the CPI. And I think if the price level's doubling every 20 years, it's hard to call that price stability. And I have never been as enthusiastic about the numerology as others. I would not have defined a 2% target initially. But I think having defined a 2% target and then having lost control to the point where the 2% target looks very hard to achieve, and then in that context, shifting to a higher target is pretty toxic from a credibility point of view. And so at some point, could I imagine a shift? Yes, I probably could. Should it be done in the context of an inflation target or a nominal GDP target? I think that's a good discussion to have. But do I think now is the moment for a discussion of a 3% inflation target? I think that's quite problematic on credibility grounds.
What did you think of the flexible average inflation targeting framework?
I think the framework in which the Fed has been operating has been almost completely has been highly unfortunate and was predictably unfortunate. I think that the Fed greatly exaggerated the dangers associated with chronic 1.6 or 1.7% inflation. I think that somehow the fact that inflation running 3 or 4 tenths low was a massive issue, but inflation running 200 basis points high last summer was not a massive issue, does not speak well to the Fed's judgment. I think what is in the FAIT and what is in the Fed's operational guidelines for implementing the FAIT, I'm not able to parse those subtleties with precision, but the judgment that there would be no takeoff until there was clear evidence of inflation above 2 was a mistake. The judgment that there would be no takeoff no matter what until we were clearly at full employment was a mistake. The rejection of anticipation as an important element of policy was a mistake. It was all done in service of the academic idea that by doing all this stuff about the future, you could convince people that you weren't going to do stuff, and therefore we're going to stay easy for a long time, and you could therefore depress real interest rates, and that would be substantially stimulative. I don't think it depressed real interest rates that much. I don't think that declining real interest rates from -30 to -60 on the 10-year do that much in the way of stimulus. I think anything they stimulate that wouldn't have been done at -30 but will be done at -60 is probably not that high socially productive investment. And I think all the committing led to fairly catastrophic errors in terms of getting behind the curve. So I would hope that with all deliberate speed, the Fed would abandon the 2020 mid-pandemic doctrine about the conduct of monetary policy.
Do you, that leads to one of the questions that's been asked, which is why do you think the Fed was hesitant earlier last year in taking inflation warnings seriously?
I think in fairness to the Fed, while it was almost inexplicable to me, and I think the record will show that I was pretty vigorous on the point, the consensus was closer to the Fed's inflation serenity than it was to my views or Olivier Blanchard's views or what became Jason Furman's views, that inflation was getting out of control to a dangerous extent. So I think that, I know many people have political theories of the Fed's behavior and so forth. I don't think the errors were characterological at all. I think they're really high integrity, really serious people. I think the errors were intellectual. And I think some of it had to do with an economics profession that had seen 40 years of low inflation and stable inflation. And basically, any statistical model fit to a constant term concludes that there's nothing that causes change. And so the view had emerged that there was a kind of robustness to low inflation. And they failed to appreciate that the robustness to low inflation had depended upon low inflation being a dominant value. And so they overlearned other kinds of lessons and found themselves repeating the errors of the past. A core principle of monetary economics, perhaps the single most important idea in monetary economics, is that nominal policies can affect nominal variables. They can't have ultimate long-run effects on real variables. And therefore, the trade-off is not between unemployment and inflation. It is between unemployment and the acceleration of inflation. And I think the Fed forgot that. And we're paying the price for their having forgotten. I I think there's every reason to think that we are at an early stage in wage price spirals.
Another viewer, I recognize you addressed balance sheet issues a little bit, but one listener wanted to draw you out a little bit about the role QT should play in the Fed's tightening, and there was the question about whether it should play in the background. I guess Janet Yellen said it should be as exciting as watching paint dry, or versus using it in a more active way. So do you have anything more to offer on this?
I think it's too complicated to try to run a two-instrument policy. I think that QE was mostly QE as a tool for bringing about stability and orderliness in markets is, I think, a very valuable thing. QE beyond that, I think, has been a rather problematic instrument. But I would, as I said earlier, stop it forthwith, and I would not be in a hurry to, and I would engage in a process of allowing significant runoff of the balance sheet, but I would not do things beyond allowing runoff of the balance sheet certainly for the next 6 months.
There's always the issue about Fed tightening and its global ramifications, and always been particular concerns about whether it would set off emerging market crises, something you had to deal with all the time in your Treasury tenure. In some respects, the emerging markets are in much better shape, but the global ramifications of the Fed role continue. So how do you see Fed tightening? Are you worried about taper tantrum or emerging market crises, or are you a little bit more sanguine this time?
I'm a little bit more sanguine. I think that the taper tantrum was a tantrum because there was an element of unexpectedness. And in some ways, whatever tightening happens now is going to have been extensively warned about, is going to take place with some element of gradualism, and the extent of flexible exchange rates in emerging markets is greater than it used to be, and the level of reserves in emerging markets are substantially greater than it used to be, and the extent of local currency debt is substantially greater than it used to be. And all of that strikes me as being all of that is benign from this point of view. Would I be worried? Yes. If I was sitting at the IMF, would I be all the way to alarmed? Quite possibly I would be. I think one respect in which the system has deteriorated is the approaches to managing debt reschedulings and debt restructurings, never fully satisfactory, I think are a good deal less satisfactory today than they once were, because of the combination of substantially more private sector debt and substantially more Chinese debt, and their non-participation in the Paris Club process. And so I think we have an awkward architecture with respect to debt reduction. It's a very hard issue because in a world where there's a substantial political and discretionary element to debt repayment, it is quite problematic to plan for failure. On the other hand, I think we've gone awfully far down the road in failing to plan.
Thank you. Since you mentioned Arthur Burns, a lot of people are talking about the current situation and trying to find historical parallels. Joe Gagnon, who we both well know, always harkens back to, I think, the Korean period. You just mentioned the 70s. Do you think there's any historical parallels here for the current situation?
History doesn't repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes. I began the year last year talking about the parallel with the Vietnam War period. You had a substantial fiscal policy with relatively accommodative monetary policy at the end of a low inflation era. It was driven by the political imperatives of the executive branch and a Fed that wanted to be cooperative. And gee, inflation went, I used to say, from having a one handle in 1966 to a six handle in 1969. Well, we've now done much more than that parallel, with inflation having gone to the sevens, and today's PPI inflation running at a double digit rate. So I don't particularly see the post-World War II parallel that some like Paul Krugman have emphasized. Seems to me a quite bizarre thing to use. You had massive demobilization going on. At that time, you had a set of effects from price controls being removed. So I can't really quite see the post-World War II parallel as useful for thinking about the inflation process right now. I think the Korean War parallel is probably a better one, but we did have a recession in 1954. We had very different kind of financial system at that time, and I think that month by month, the Korean War parallel is looking less and less plausible as the inflation is looking less and less transitory that we are dealing with. So I think the kind of extended Vietnam period remains the best parallel for thinking about this moment.
All right, I think I have two more questions and then we'll have to wrap it up. So the first question is short, sweet, but obviously you mentioned housing a little bit earlier and its impact on inflation, but there is a question about how you see the housing market and demand supply and what it means for prices.
The main proposition on which I have conviction is that the CPI and the PCE treatment of housing, because it tries to put a price on people who are staying in their houses, has substantial lags to more market-based indices. And therefore, even if nothing particularly dramatic happens this year, I would be looking for 6 to 7% housing inflation. Given that that housing is 40% of the core CPI, that says that we would have close to 2.5% CPI inflation this year, even if every other component was at zero. That's the principal proposition on which I have conviction. I would guess that house price inflation is going to slow, but not turn negative this year. I think the combination of high mortgage rates, higher mortgage rates, more uncertainty will lead to some reduction in housing inflationary pressures. On the other hand, I think that the supply of houses for sale remains very substantially constricted. And that suggests to me that it's going to be a while before this entirely slows down.
Okay, this is the last question. This one's coming from me, not the audience, but it's about the future of productivity. So productivity has been slowing over time. Some are arguing, well, artificial intelligence, infrastructure can jumpstart productivity and raise it. Others are dubious or talk about the fact that it takes a long time for these improvements to diffuse into daily life. So how do you see the future of productivity in the United States?
Mark, I don't have a crystal ball for that. And I think there are all kinds of issues of measurement. It's really better to go through an airport using your cell phone than it used to be when you had to carry a ticket and go to the counter and get a boarding pass. And none of that's reflected in the CPI. I'd rather get I'd rather get today's healthcare at today's prices than 1980 healthcare at 1980 prices. But that would say there hasn't been healthcare inflation. And that's certainly not what our indices measure. So I think there's a lot of questions about what our indices measure. I think if I had to guess, there will be modest improvements in the rate of productivity growth, but not vast increases in the rate of productivity growth. But that's not a judgment that I feel like I can make with any great confidence.
Well, thank you. I mean, we've essentially run out of time. So I want to thank you very profusely. I said at the start, you're one of the great economic thinkers of our time, and you've lived up to that today with fascinating insights. You've been extraordinarily generous with your time. It's an honor that I had to work with you at Treasury, and I'm always treat reverentially our secretaries of the Treasury. So Larry Summers is 71st Secretary of the Treasury, and it's great to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
Today.
It was a real privilege to be with you.